And we're live.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dan Levitov, and I'm the coordinator of cello and chamber music at the Peabody Preparatory. And I also am the director of string ensembles at the Bryn Mawr School. And you can find me this summer on the faculty of the Credo Music Festival at the Oberlin Conservatory. Although, of course, like many summer festivals, this summer it will be taking place completely online. So I'm really glad that you're here with me tonight, and I want to just first of all thank the Cello Bello team for welcoming me and for making these cello chats happen. I think in this time where we can't get together in person and play in person, I have certainly found these kinds of online discussions really valuable. And I welcome your comments and your questions in the chat. What I plan to do, the topic of my presentation this evening is on preparing for conservatory auditions. So what I plan to do is talk a little bit about that process from my perspective as a teacher of conservatory bound students. And of course you're welcome to share your questions in the chat. I'll probably won't answer questions directly for the first portion of our discussion, and then of course I'd be happy to get to all of your questions. So if I'm not immediately getting to your question, hang on, keep the questions coming, and we'll get to it. So preparing for conservatory auditions is such an exciting and thrilling time for a student, and of course it's also an exciting and perhaps sometimes stressful time for a teacher to help that student prepare in the best possible way. And I think as we formulate our discussion today, I'm hoping that our discussion will be of interest to students who are on the cusp of a audition run, cellists, and perhaps those who are not quite ready, maybe a few years out or considering a career in music, who want to know a little bit more about the process and what it means to prepare for that process. Of course, for teachers as well, who seem to have to go through this process many times as we prepare our students and to help them make their successful conservatory auditions. So I know the meat of our conversation is going to be about how to prepare and all the facets of that, but I just want to take a little bit of a moment maybe to talk about the who, the what, and the where a little bit before we get to the how. And so what I mean by who, of course, is who is it that's taking a conservatory audition? And I assume that if you're joining me here, that you have an interest in this topic, then you're one of those people, which is fantastic. But I think it is valuable to think about what that means to go through this process. I mean, obviously we know that to audition for conservatories we want to be playing at a high level, and we can talk about what that is. But I think it's important for us to also think about the other aspects of it. In other words, that perhaps playing at a high level shouldn't be the only consideration when you're considering whether to have an audition run and pursue a career in music, or at least pursue a conservatory degree. I think that there are some other attributes besides being able to play well that are really important. As a teacher, it's my job to help my students find their musical voice, but I think it's also my job to help them to come to an understanding about how music fits into their life. And I'm always very careful about not projecting onto them if I think they would make a great musician, or if I think music school might not be right for them. I really want to draw them out and help them to have that conversation and get to know them as an artist and as a cellist and as a person, and try to fit in what's going to happen in the future for them. I think there's sort of an age-old tradition of a mentor figure saying discouraging words to a younger student, and I've always found that in some way a little hypocritical, because of course I went to conservatory and pursued a music degree, so why should I discourage a young person? But at the same time, I do feel like it's important for an instructor to help a young student to understand what it is to pursue a career in music, that that there are rejections and there are dissatisfactions and there's instability, and that's part of it. And I think it's important for us to understand that. Maybe the most important factor, in addition to of course the way you play, has to do with your openness, because I do think as you are moving from your pre-college life into your college life, there's going to be changes. You're going to have a new teacher, a new environment, and hopefully there's going to be changes in your playing too. And I think it's really important for someone who's about to embark on this process to be really open and eager for changes in their playing and in the way that they conceive of music. So I'll leave it at that for now. I want to talk just a little bit about perhaps what when this training should begin. So from a teacher perspective, it's kind of an interesting question actually, because when you think about, well, what makes a great conservatory bound cellist, I think, well, someone who's a great artist, someone who has a really high level of technical polish and precision and consistency, someone who's a critical thinker, someone who, like as I said, has a certain openness and charisma on stage. Lots of these factors, and all of these factors, from a teacher perspective, I think of as teaching from the first lesson. And I'm in a very fortunate position as a prep teacher to often have students for many, many years. Some of my conservatory students, or conservatory bound students, I have for 6 or 7 years before they go off to conservatory, and quite a number of them I've had for 14 years or so, from their first lesson on the instrument all the way until they leave for conservatory. And that's quite a responsibility, but it's also interesting for me because I can really think about sort of reverse engineering that process and thinking about what you need for that conservatory entry, and thinking about, well, how can I build that skill from the first lessons all the way through to that point. So that's the part that sort of is just inherent, I think, from the beginning. But perhaps, it would be a mistake to think that we should be preparing to actually take an audition from an early age, and that we should be practicing audition techniques, at age 10, 11, 12, etc. I think we don't want to train ourselves to be great auditioners. We want to train ourselves to be great musicians. Of course, that's really why we're here. So I'm careful not to start that process too early. I don't want to deaden us to the music that we're studying. And so, I think that now that most top conservatories have a pre-screen round, I think that does sort of set that process back a little bit. In other words, instead of needing to be ready, say, in January or February of your senior year in high school, you really need to be ready by November. And so that process has to, I think, start at, in this, maybe the spring semester of the junior year approximately. Of course, it's different for every student. And when I say that process, I'm not just talking about learning the repertoire, but I'm also talking about necessary performances. I think it's really important to get these works on stage, to understand what it feels like to play it with accompaniment in front of an audience, so that you can recreate that experience when you're actually in your audition. And I also think it's important to have lived with the repertoire. I mean, I teach some students who learn music very, very fast, and they are capable of learning major pieces, in the couple months leading up to an audition. But I wonder if they perhaps haven't settled with them, and maybe could gain more from them with just a little bit more depth in their study. So I do try to start that process early. Another really important part of starting in the junior year is the opportunity to play for potential teachers, which I think is really, really important. When you're going off to study in conservatory, you want to, of course, study with a great artist, and there's so many fabulous artists and pedagogues out there that we can all learn so much from. But you want to have someone who you're ready to trust. You're ready to really absorb what they have to say, and you feel like what they have to offer you is exactly what you need. I think that trial lesson process is a very important part of the process. I also think from a teacher perspective, if I'm a conservatory teacher and I get to know a young cellist in their junior year, I can get excited about them for the next year, but also I can in some ways track their growth over that year, and that tells me a lot. And I can really understand their eagerness, and so I do think that that's important. I will say that I think sometimes there's a danger of starting that repertoire too soon, or only playing the audition program for almost close to a year, And I really caution against that, especially for us to stay fresh and stay alive with our instrument. We want to keep learning. We don't want to stop the learning process in the junior year and just kind of repeat the same performance many times until the actual audition. I hope that my students can continue to grow through the audition process and beyond the audition process, so that they are a different cellist when they begin this process from when they end it, or when they end it from when they begin it. In terms of repertoire, I think, of course, the most important thing is for us to think about, of course, is the requirements. And it seems very simple to go to each conservatory and look at what requirements, but actually sometimes a student doesn't read them exactly right, or doesn't prepare all the repertoire. And I would say that it's not only that you want to prepare all the repertoire, but as you think about what colleges or conservatories you want to apply to, I do think that one has to consider how much repertoire you can keep in your fingers. So in other words, if you're playing sort of the standard audition program of a concerto movement and a couple movements of Bach and a virtuosic etude, if you start to take on an audition where you need a full concerto or a full Bach suite or a sonata movement or a romantic piece, that might be appropriate for some people, and that might not for others, and it might actually detract from the success at other conservatories. So I would say that this is a conversation for you with your teacher, and it's something that you want to really think carefully about. In terms of exactly what repertoire, I mean, I'm sure that's a burning question in some ways, and it's a challenging one in some ways, because I don't believe that there's the one concerto that's going to get you into conservatory, and I really think very carefully about the concerto movement that I would choose for any individual student. I think it has to match, and it's an interesting match from a teacher perspective, because oftentimes when I'm choosing repertoire, I'm different than some teachers. I don't say, well, after you play the Saint-Saëns concerto, then you play the Lalo concerto, and then comes Elgar. I don't have a sequence like that. I'm really trying to think about what my students need and what's going to challenge them appropriately, and what I want to work on. In other words, what are my technical and musical goals? So sometimes I'm choosing repertoire for my students that's helping them to sort of fill in something that I feel like they need to develop more with. But when it comes to the audition, of course, we want to pick something that we think that it's going to show their best stuff. So sometimes that's kind of an interesting calculus there. You might think about. I would just say, please choose a standard concerto. I think if you choose an unknown concerto or a very rarely played concerto, and there are some really wonderful concertos out there. I had the chance a few years back to learn a Mio concerto, the second concerto, which is a fantastic piece. But to audition on a piece like that, I wouldn't recommend it, because your panel they don't really know it well, and they may not understand the technical challenges, and I think that you're not putting your best foot forward when you challenge an audition panel that way. So I definitely recommend a standard concerto. Many conservatories recommend first two movements of Shostakovich, not just the first, or two movements of Elgar, either the first two or the last two, and I would say that I often recommend those recommendations for students, even when the student is applying to a school that doesn't require that, just because I feel that perhaps I want my students to be able to display the totality of what they can do. And I think that first movement of Shostakovich concerto, we don't get a sense of the lyrical and the flexible, and I would like for my students to be able to show that, the Elgar concerto first movement gives us a lot, actually quite a lot, about a cellist, but perhaps the panel is wondering, well, how would this cellist handle something like the second movement? So these are things to think about. In terms of Bach, obviously we usually are choosing a prelude and another movement from the same suite. I think the most standard suites are usually 2, 3, 4, and 6. I think I tend to shy away from ever having students audition on 5 because of the score to tour. I think it's very problematic. And I think with 4 and 6, we just want to be very mindful of making sure that these are suites that are going to show you off in the best, just because the E flat prelude is so challenging for intonation, and the 6th suite has quite a bit of technical demands. That's not to say that you shouldn't audition on those. I think you should, but of course this is something in consultation with your teacher. And I often choose an etude late in the game. I'll let my students work through etudes, not deciding on an etude. And I would say I do the same actually with the non-prelude movement of Bach, that I'm letting them work through the suite, and then I'm choosing which of the Bach movements other than the prelude and which etude that's going to be on the audition program, maybe sometime in the fall. So just a thought on that. And so with that, I just want to move right into how are we going to prepare for conservatory auditions, which I think is probably the big question of our talk today. And there's some ways that practicing for an audition should not be different than the practicing that you would do for the concert stage. I mean, I think you want to dig deep into the music. You want to connect to it personally and artistically. You want to have that high technical standard. You want to present something that you have presented on stage before. So there's some ways that are the same, but I do think that there are some ways that we want to think very differently about the audition process. One question that may come up as we go along in our discussion is, about interpretation. And I would say that, at least from my own experience working with conservatory level students and talking with conservatory teachers, I think that conservatory teachers are often looking for a musical voice. And it's something I really encourage in my own students. So I don't think that, even if you're playing in a way, sometimes you go and have a sample lesson and you hear the professor play music maybe with different interpretive choices than you have made. I don't think that you necessarily should. In fact, I don't recommend mimicking those choices, each teacher, and trying to line up your interpretation into what you think the teacher would want. I think that conservatory teachers are looking for genuine, committed performances. So when it comes to practicing, obviously we know we want to have a high degree of technical precision, but I think that what we want to think about as we are preparing to present our material is, first of all, that in an audition, it's not a full recital or concert, and first impressions are very important. And so one of the things that a way to practice, which I think is very important, is to practice. Feel free to warm up, but then practice presenting something right away. And I often recommend for my students, all my students, but especially my students making an audition run, that they record themselves all the time in their practice, short little recordings, and listen back right away, get that feedback. But that you practice that process of starting, because you don't get a second chance to play the exposition of your concerto. And I would say, of course, beginnings are very important, but really starting anywhere, so that if you are starting with, not the prelude of your Bach suite, or occasionally if you have 2 movements of a concerto, you might be asked to play not starting from the beginning. So beginnings are important, but it's also this process of starting and playing well right from the beginning that we have to practice that. And there are all sorts of interesting ways to practice that, actually. Sometimes we can warm up and then put the cello down and take a 5-minute break and then come back and play. Sometimes we can warm up in one room and then move to another room and play. And I think, again, we're trying to think about that audition process and what is that going to be like, and how can we prepare for that. I think when you think about what a panel is listening for, I think the first thing that they sort of want to hear, they really want to hear you. I don't think they're looking, trying to, find the flaws. They want to hear you at your best. So I think you can go in with a very positive attitude. And I think that when it comes to things that may not go the way that you want, but I think what the panel is really looking for is they don't want to see any red flags. In other words, if there's a note that's out of tune, I don't think that's going to make or break your audition. But if there's a consistent pattern of intonation issues, then that might be something that raises some concerns. So again, when you're practicing, you're thinking about consistency. Um, you're thinking about sort of showing that you are very comfortable with the repertoire, that you can play with that, with a beautiful sound, that you have a lovely vibrato, that you have control over the instrument. So I think that's really important. In terms of timing, I think this is something that's often a challenge for students who are most students who are auditioning for conservatory haven't done it before, and it's a very new thing. And suddenly we have all this music on our plate at once, and we're not used to that. I think younger students especially are not used to that. They usually play a piece and perform it, and play something else, and they might have a couple pieces in there, on their plate, but maybe they're not all at the same levels of performance ready. So this is a new thing, and I think again from a teacher perspective, perhaps it's valuable to have a student have a few pieces performance ready prior to taking the audition run. But in terms of practicing, this is quite challenging because, of course, we want to practice a lot, and I think we have to think about how are we going to spend the time, because if we're just running through our repertoire, we're not really going deep and building our skills. And I think in a way, when we don't have those like slow practice, recording device, drone, metronome, really in-depth practice, we lose our sensitivity to the instrument. So I really believe in that kind of practice. But of course, if you practice slow all the time, then you feel like you're not getting your pieces ready for performance. And so there are lots of different ways to balance this, and I really recommend a creative approach. So one way is to sort of set a schedule and kind of cycle through your repertoire. And another way is you could pick a day and say, well, today I'm going to touch everything, and maybe I'm not going to play every note of everything, but I'm going to touch everything. And another day I'm really just going to spend time on my Bach prelude, and maybe just to make myself feel comfortable, I'll play a passage in my concerto, but today is Bach prelude day. As we get closer to the audition, we want to think about like really thoughtful kind of organization of the practice day. In other words, perhaps creating like an A group, a B group, and a C group, where the A group is all the repertoire that's audition ready. If you had to just walk into a room and audition for conservatory, you feel like you're ready to go. And B being sort of the next step down from that, you feel like you're getting close, but you're not quite there, you're fine-tuning. And C being the pieces that are needing more significant work. And I think when you group them that way, that helps organize the practice. And you may find that you are reshuffling those categories. You're moving pieces between A, B, and C, and you may even have specific passages that are moving between A, B, and C. And I think that's a really interesting way to practice. I think it's important to make sure we have some resting time. We don't want to, if you've never practiced hours and hours and hours a day and suddenly you start, that's not going to be healthy for you. So you want to be mindful of practice breaks and rest, and outside stimulation, I think, is actually really important. But I will say this, oftentimes, many times, our conservatory-bound students are multi-talented. They're smart, they are good at athletics, they have hobbies, and this is a time when you really have to think about prioritization. And I think that's something, again, it's a discussion with your private teacher. But I think if you're serious about a conservatory education, about conservatory training, it's time to structure your life in such a way that you can do the necessary work. And of course, that's going to be true in college too. I think it's important sometimes. I'll just say just a couple of things more. I think when you, obviously every week you're playing for your private teachers, you're preparing your audition repertoire, that's not nearly enough feedback at this stage of the game. When you're preparing for auditions, you need to play for friends. You need to make recordings of yourself. I often ask my students to send in recordings midweek to me of like something very specific, a little passage, and I hear them. You need to create performance situations as part of your practice. Sometimes lessons become mock auditions, not every lesson, but you know, I think as we get closer, we want to get very comfortable with running through the audition program. Sometimes, you know, maybe playing every single note that's required in an audition, which of course is probably not the way that you're going to have an actual audition, but that way you're not you're prepared for everything, and you don't have to expect, oh, they're only going to hear the exposition of my concerto, etc. You're really ready for everything. I already talked a little bit about playing for professors. I just want to add that as you have those trial lessons, of course, you want to show your eagerness genuinely, but I think it's really important to take what you receive back to your private teacher and work through that. And make that a part of the process. I think there are some things that a private teacher is really excited to hear from a potential teacher, and there are other things that that maybe the private teacher decides to put on hold. You know, if you go and have a trial lesson and somebody says, well, you know, I think, you know, if you were to come and study with me, you know, I would want to, you know, really rework your bow arm, which is something that often happens in like the first year of conservatory. You know, if I was advising a student, I would say, let's save that for conservatory. That's not something that we want to do right now, but I want you to be really open to that process, because that is an important part of entering conservatories, being ready to rework your technique. So I just want to spend just a couple more minutes just talking about like really preparing like right before the audition, and then I think I will open it up for questions. I see some questions are coming in on the chat, and I want to make sure I get to your questions. But you know, I do think that as you get closer to the actual date, there are a couple of things that you want to think about. I should say that, you know, in an ideal world, you have a couple of auditions that aren't your top schools that you take first, because I do think it's important to think of the audition process as kind of like a building process, that you're building your skills, and you can learn so much from those early auditions. I think about the Rafa Nadal, the tennis player, and he always talks about, like, you know, as he's playing the early rounds of these major tournaments, about, you know, not feeling his best, and he's sort of building. You know, he's not putting it all out there, and he just keeps building and building and building towards the final. And I think that's kind of a really interesting mentality. And of course, you know, when he's at his building stage, he's still, you know, creaming the other guys. But you know, as you get closer, you want to, you know, rest is more important. You don't want to kill yourself practicing. Eating well, eating predictably. You know, this isn't the time to you know, try new food the night before your audition, or you know, but rest and eating well, feeling good are really important. And then I think the one thing I want to emphasize, maybe or two things, something before the audition and something at the audition. I think before the audition, I ask my students who are auditioning for conservatory to develop a very, like, carefully timed and organized pre-audition routine, like maybe as much as like 2 hours before the audition, up to the audition, about really knowing exactly what they're going to do. And I really do mean exactly, like, you know, when you're going to play this piece, and how you're going to play this piece, and when you're going to, you know, take a 5-minute break, and when you're going to eat a banana, or whatever it is. And I think that there's one of the challenges of taking an audition is you're in a new environment. You're at a new school, you're in a room that you don't know, you're around other people you don't know. But there are some things that can be constant. Your instrument is constant, your training is constant, and this routine is something that can be a constant part. So you feel like that, you know you went through this process, and you're ready for the audition. And then, you know, I do think that when you get into the audition, and you're actually there in front of the panel, that it's important, of course, to play well, to be very musically connected and centered, and feel like you're giving a real performance. And to be genuine, to be yourself. And I think there is a way of presenting sort of like an honest musician and an open musician, because I do think that every teacher wants to teach someone who's very open to listening to what they have to say, very eager to learn, eager to grow. And if you can project that in the audition, I think that's a really nice feature to be able to display at the audition, in addition to the way that you play. I probably have lots more to say, The one thing I'll say, and then I'm gonna go to the chat questions, is that I got some really good advice from a mentor of mine. Actually, it wasn't my private cello teacher when I was in high school. In addition to my high school orchestra and my youth symphony, I also played in the local university orchestra, and the conductor was the concertmaster of the local symphony. And he said, yeah, wherever you go, of course, he said that the finding that teacher match is so important. It's the most important thing. But he said something else which I think is really important. And he said, when you go, he said, go on a Friday night, and he said, go into the practice rooms, go in at 9:30 at night, 10 at night, and if people are practicing, that's where you want to go. And and he really emphasized to me not just to go where people are working, but to when you go to conservatory, to find those people who are striving to get better, who are really working hard. And I was lucky enough in my undergraduate at the Oberlin Conservatory and in my master's degree at Manhattan School of Music and in my doctorate to have had colleagues and friends who we could practice next to each other and play for each other and motivate each other. And I think that that was a really important thing for me. So with that, I'm just gonna rest my cello here so I can just get a little closer to the chat and find out what your questions are. I want to make sure I'm addressing some of your questions. So I'm just going to back up to the top of the chat here. And if you haven't put a question into the chat yet, please do. I'm very happy to answer your questions and hear what you are curious about in terms of preparing for a conservatory audition. So the first question here says, what are a few core principles that you encourage your students to focus on in the practice room? And that's such a great question, and I love this. In fact, I was just teaching a lesson. Of course, I was teaching a lesson online, as we all are these days, but I was just teaching a lesson earlier today, and I was teaching this young student and saying that you want to feel like at any moment that you're playing, somebody could like burst into the room and throw open the door and say, "What are you thinking about right now?" And I, and it's not just like, "Oh, I want to make this better," but to really be thinking about like why you're playing what you're playing and what you're trying to emphasize. So, one of the things that I really believe in is connecting our musicianship to our technique, and so this is something that I think is sometimes underemphasized. But I would say that, when we think about shaping a beautiful phrase and, maybe we want to say, well, I want this to be very lyrical and expressive and the climax is here and I want to finish over there. I really want my students to take the next step and think, well, what is that? What are the implications of that statement for my bow speed, for my contact point, for my vibrato, for the amount of hair, for the flexibility in my bow arm, for the way that I shift, for my vibrato, for the way that my vibrato changes, and to really answer that question in a very technical way. So I really think that connecting musicianship and technique are really important as you prepare, because I think that sort of locks it in, and it actually allows a performer to be spontaneous, because you have those technical skills, and that if you want to shape it a different way, that you have the technical understanding to know how to do that. I really believe that, especially if you're preparing at the highest levels, that you want to put intonation practice at the forefront of your study. I tell my students that I want them to do intonation and. In other words, everything that they're working on is intonation and that thing. So if you're working on shifting, it's intonation and shifting. If you're working on rhythm, it's intonation and rhythm. And that the intonation is just sort of always in the background. And we want to be thinking not just about playing in tune, but the real nuances of playing in tune, in terms of getting our cello ringing, in terms of knowing what key you are in, not just the key of your concerto or your Bach suite, but the key of the moment that you're in, and how the intonation changes based on what key you're in. And if any of you are interested, I can go on about that. So I think intonation is a really, really key principle. So, musical and technical connection, intonation. I think stage presence or charisma, one could say, or one's ability to share expressively is really important. And that has to be practiced. I mean, I have some students, or I've experienced some students who are I feel like, oh well, when I'm on stage, I'll turn that on, and I think that we want to practice that in. Again, we want to recreate the performance experience in the practice room, so that when you actually are in front of the panel at your audition, you don't feel like you have to do something different. Oh, now I have to be musical. I didn't have to worry about that, but now no. To me, you just say, well, all I have to do is just do what I did when I practiced, and that gives you a lot of comfort as you perform. Let me go to another question here. It says, what top 3 technical concepts do you find students have the most trouble grasping? Only 3. And no, actually, I think students, it's kind of interesting the way this question is worded, actually, because it says, what technical concepts do students have the most trouble grasping? And when my students have trouble grasping a concept, that's on me. At least that's the way I think of it. And, I feel a little bit lucky to have started teaching at an extremely young age when I was still in high school. And, of course, I didn't know how to teach. And so what happened is that I would tell a student something and they would give me a blank stare, and I would have to do something else and tell them a different way of conceiving of the same thing. So I do feel like that students that it's on the responsibility of the teacher in some way to help the student understand these technical concepts. But maybe I can rephrase that and talk about some of the most challenging technical concepts. And maybe I can talk about one left hand and one right hand for now. So for left hand, I'm going to just grab my cello for just a second. I think, for me, the most important thing that I want to build with the left hand is, of course, in order to play very in tune, I want to play very consistently. And I think building the structure of the left hand shape is a really important technical concept, and it's something that you can take with you wherever you go. And so I'm really thoughtful about the way that I put my fingers on the string, and I want to think about like a shape that's a repeatable shape. Something that it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be different when I practice tomorrow or next week or next year, but it's something the same. Sometimes we can learn about hand frame a lot by practicing exercises like the Kosman studies, which, by the way, I like to teach very slowly because I really want to. I think when they're written in 16th notes if in the Kosman book, but I often teach them very slowly as a way to really help us really feel the different balance of the fingers, the exact fingertip contact point, the way that we lift and land our fingers. I think teaching of double stops is absolutely critical to teaching and playing of double stops is critical to beautiful left hand shape. And I think if I can just go on with that maybe one more second, that many of us have a developed shape here, and then when it comes up to here, I think it's kind of like anything goes. And I really believe that we want to develop a consistent shape, and all my students practice a sliding exercise where we practice maintaining the shape through all of the positions, maintaining the fingertip contact point, maintaining the finger angle, so that when we get up high, we have the same kind of consistency we have down low. Now, we don't all have the same size hands. And even within our own hand, of course, we don't all have the same size fingers within that hand. And so for me as a teacher, I'm very sensitive that my perfect hand shape may not be exactly the same as my students. And so, again, I don't want all my students' hand shapes to look just like mine, just like I don't want them to all sound just like me. I want them to find their own musical voice. But I do want them to be able to have a consistent shape, and I think especially in the upper positions that's really important. So by the way, those Kosman exercises, you can practice them in the upper position, or you can do variations on double stop exercises the same way. Thumb position scales, very important. In fact, because I think double stops and thumb position scales are so important, and I mentioned to you I helped develop this book, Two Octave Scales and Bowings. Susan Brown is a fantastic violin pedagogue and teacher, and she made these books for violin and viola, and I worked with her to adapt the book for cello. And one of the things that we added in the cello book was a thumb position scale. And of course, it also has thirds and sixths in one octave, so that's kind of like a preparation, an intermediate level preparation for this kind of thing that I'm talking about. With the bow, boy, I think relaxation and flexibility is the technical thing that I would say is the technical concept that I want to emphasize. We have this terrible word, bow hold, or even worse, bow grip. And I don't really have a better word, but I really want to teach malleability, flexibility, and change of balance. I really believe that the bow hold is ever changing, and as we draw a bow, the balance in the bow hold is changing all the time. I do open string work with that, so I'm really feeling the balance. And flexibility. So those are a few technical concepts that I think are really important. And I would say maybe if I had to pick a third, I would talk about the balance of the shoulders and the hips. I think that's a really important thing for cellists. Making sure that we feel in balance. I'll give you just one of my little things that I like to think about. I happen to notice that when I hold my bow perfectly straight up in the air like this, you can all try this at home, it feels very light in my hand, and as I tilt it this way or this way, it is literally out of balance and it feels heavy in my hand. It feels very light this way. I can hold it very, very lightly, and I like to think of this as kind of a metaphor for the way that my torso sits on my hips and the way that my head sits on my shoulders, that I want to feel very light and agile but in balance all the time. And so again, that might be different for different people, but I want to find that place where my upper body feels light and free. I'm going to go to the next question here. When you play quickly, do you press the string all the way down to the fingerboard? Great question, really great question. I think that we want to play with it as little effort as possible. I tell some of my younger students that I'm the only teacher they have who tells them not to work so hard, because of course they're being told at school to work their hardest, and I'm telling them to not work their hardest in a way, at least physically. Of course, intellectually and mentally, I want them to be on overdrive, but and emotionally. But I will say that I do believe in a really light finger approach. The way that I would talk about it is, first of all, I think that releasing the fingers is extremely important. So when we're done with the fingers, we do not want them to continue to be weighted onto the string. We want to release them and balance on the new finger. If you do teach very, very young students, sometimes you teach them a cello hug. It's kind of the first thing you learn, and of course we have the most huggable instrument of all the instruments, so we should practice our cello hugs all the time. But I do like this because what I'm doing right now is I'm resting all my arm weight onto the strings. I'm using absolutely no muscles whatsoever, and yet I have enough weight into the string right now to play any piece in the repertoire, absolutely any piece in the repertoire. So then your only challenge is to take this feeling of weight and put it right here, right? So I don't actually like the word pressing into the string at all. I like to think about weight and balance. Next question that I see here, which edition do you recommend for the box suites and why? Great question. And I think that we're so lucky now, I think, actually to have great editions of the Bach cello suites that at least weren't available to me when I was first studying them. And I do think this is important. I think I'm sure it's every cellist's dream to go into an antique store and find Bach's original manuscript. But since we don't have that, we have to do the next best thing and look for good editions. And I really studied the suites using the August Wenzinger edition of the Bach cello suites, and more recently than that, my Wenzinger edition is tattered and worn. In fact, it has a cover that you may not even recognize anymore. but I also have this, the critical Bärenreiter edition, which has all of our manuscript sources, or our oldest sources, including not just Anna Magdalena but Kellner and anonymous sources and others, as incredibly valuable. I think there are probably some questions that we can never answer in the Bach cello suites, and maybe we don't want the original Bach. I think the fact that we're always seeking answers and trying to understand how to articulate is quite fascinating, and one of the reasons why we keep coming back to these incredible pieces of music. So those are the editions that I recommend. I think both are valuable. I think if I can just say just a quick word about editions in general, which is that I very much like to work from Urtext editions to get as close to the composer's own markings as I possibly can. But sometimes it is interesting to look at edited versions. I'm thinking, especially about some of our edited versions from a couple generations, whether they're Starker or Rose editions. And it's interesting for me just to think about the choices that those great performers made. And what I often want to do when I look at those is not say, well, Leonard Rose did a third finger or an up bow, and that's therefore I will do it, but to think about well, why was that choice made, and look at it especially in comparison to perhaps the composer's own markings, especially in terms of articulation and bowing, and think about, well, why was this choice made, and do I want to make that choice, or do I want to make a different choice? And I mentioned that I really want my students to find their own individual voices, but I also want them to be able to justify their musical choices, especially justify them in terms of the composer's original markings. So I do think that that's really important. Next question: how do you recommend your students approach the pieces they are learning for the first time? That's a great question, and of course there are a lot of different directions we could go with this. I think that one of the things that I like to recommend when students first come to a piece, and of course this depends on what level the student is, and different for a beginning or intermediate, but I'm going to assume for our purposes today that we're talking about a conservatory bound student. One of the things that I think is so important is that we take care with that first time. There can only really be one first time of looking at a piece, and so it's actually very special. And I like to encourage my students not to go to YouTube first, but to really experience that connection of discovering what the music is about for themselves the first time, and thinking about it carefully. And I would also say that I would hope that my students, when they approach a new piece of music, think about the things that they're working on in their own technique, or the things that we're working on in the lessons, and try to apply those principles to something that they haven't seen before. In other words, not to wait for their teacher to tell them, oh, remember, we've been really working on your vibrato, and but to think about, well, how can my work on vibrato apply to this new piece, or how can my new understanding of bow placement, how can I use that as I learn this piece? I also, maybe differently than some other teachers, often ask my advanced students to work out fingerings for themselves. I was very lucky to have a high school teacher, one of two great teachers that I had when I was in high school, who was a Pariso student, who asked me just in lessons to come up with several different fingerings for the same passage. Now try another one, now try another one, now try another one. And I really found value in that. And as a teacher, my hope is that my students have some ideas about why we make fingering choices. So if I just give them my fingerings, I feel like I'm not training them to think about fingerings critically. So that's just a little bit about that. Next question. How would you advise the student on approaching the second movement of the Elgar Cello Concerto? Great question. It's a big undertaking. It's such a fantastic piece. I would say, first of all, make sure you've got your good edition for a second movement of Elgar Concerto, because in the introduction there's a very famous wrong note, so you want to be aware of that. So that's just a quick little plug for a good Bärenreiter edition of the Elgar Cello Concerto. But I think probably this person is asking more about the molto allegro And I think it's very important to practice on the string. Really critical to practice on the string. So I really recommend practicing an on the string stroke, not trying a sautier stroke at all for a long time. And I think that helps in several different ways. I think, first of all, I think it helps the left hand have really, really excellent lifting and landing energy, so it's clean. When you're playing just a legato détaché stroke, I think you really hear everything. So it requires much more left-hand precision, and I also think that there's an opportunity to work on phrasing that way when you're playing with an on-the-string détaché stroke. So I think that is the thing, and then my recommendation in terms of finding that bow stroke is to start shrinking the amount of bow. In other words, if you started out in a slower tempo using a certain amount of bow, to shrink it down and let the bow do the work. In other words, we have a very light bow grip, and let the bow, the natural springiness of your stick, create that crisp sautier stroke. And I think that this is one where finding the right fingering in a couple passages is actually really important. So this might be one where you could try a few fingerings, but you might of course talk to your teacher, but you might also look at either go to YouTube or have access to some other cellists and look at some of the fingerings that they do, because I do think that there are some nice tricks to help make a couple of those passages a little bit easier. Do you have any tips for playing the cello without looking at the fingerboard? How do I practice looking up and not at my instrument? Great, and I think this is really important. I do think that as cellists, of course we know we have the best instrument, but we also have the most ergonomic instrument. It sits in our lap, and we can be very balanced as we play. But we do have this one disadvantage, which is that when we're in the lower positions, everything's going on over here, and if we do take a look, everything is disrupted in our technique. Our shoulders are out of alignment. Our fingers, you can see the roundness of my finger shape, which I was just talking about how important that consistent shape is, goes away. Everything is out of balance. My fourth finger is in a very weak position. So this is just a terrible feeling. At the same time, when we're in our upper positions, when we bring the head forward to look at what's going on, I think it provides comfort for us. I think somehow all of us cellists are a little bit nearsighted, and we all want to get close to our upper position playing, but it's actually it really is disruptive to our technique. And just as an exercise that I sometimes do with my students, I have them just practice doing an air bow like this, and then having them get into that upper position shape and do the same thing, and you feel your arm moves more slowly, it feels weak, it feels tight, there's tension right back here. So I really recommend not leaning over the instrument when we play in the upper positions. Now the question really was how, and I think there are a few answers to that. Maybe one of them is that we want to practice heightening our non-visual senses. In other words, really practicing feeling shifts, feeling what it feels like to play in tune. Of course, we want to hear our intonation as well, but the hearing is kind of more in response. I often tell my students that hearing your intonation is a little bit like it's like a doctor taking your temperature. You take your temperature and it says 102, and you say, well, you're sick. And so hearing is like, it's diagnostic, or it's we say, oh, well, that note is out of tune, and it doesn't really answer the question of why it was out of tune and how we can land on the note in tune, because of course either we land on it or we don't, and so really we have to play in tune before we hear it. And so I really recommend getting in touch with the sense of feel. Practicing slow shifts, practicing slow scales. I like to do scales on one string. I like to do thumb position scales, and I do that, feeling that sense of balance and feel. So I may or may not have my eyes closed, but I'm really feeling what it feels like to play the instrument, to play a certain note or a certain passage. So So I think that's important. A lot of times getting in front of a mirror can help us to, if we do need to be, because sometimes we do need to be monitoring our bow. We do need to be, for straightness of bow, for example, or we do want to make sure that we're playing with a beautiful left-hand shape. That's when I would recommend getting in front of a mirror. I don't recommend practicing your full session in front of a mirror because then we sort of become desensitized to that. So I do recommend a specific mirror practice, organized mirror practice. Okay, let's move on to the next question. When you're trying to project, how do you play, and your excitement to be at the audition? How do you show the best aspects? For example, I'm very technical and do well when I'm learning, but I don't get the audition and seem to portray the best aspects. Good. I think this is a good question, and I think managing that excitement is really an important part of being a performer. And actually, I think there are some things I was mentioning earlier. We don't want to just like practice to take great auditions. We want to practice to be a great artist. But maybe this is something that we can gain from auditions, is that like the ability to play predictably in unpredictable circumstances, or to play predictably in what can be more stressful circumstances. And one way to do this is to really like get control over energy level. And I would say, you could challenge yourself to like make an energy scale from 1 to 20, and and say, well, I'm going to play this passage at energy level 17, and I'm going to play the same passage at energy level 19 or energy level 14, and find out what that experience is like. And by energy level, I am not at all talking about dynamics. I'm talking about kind of energetic commitment. And I think that we want to find a sweet spot. We don't want to be so energized that we kind of can't maintain control over our technique. And at the same time, we want to be really alive musically. I really believe in what I call, any of my students who are watching know what I'm talking about, musical amnesia. And of course, I don't mean that we forget how to play the cello, but what I do mean is I think again about that experience that I was just mentioning earlier about playing the cello for the first time, playing a new piece for the first time is what I'm trying to say, and that we don't know what's coming. Right, and that's really how our listener experiences music, or how we want them to. We want them to hear it like it's the world premiere, even if we're playing a Beethoven sonata. And so we have to have the sense of amnesia that we are surprised and maybe charmed or dramatized by what happens next. That change of harmony, that change of note surprises us, and we are in wonder of that next note. And I think when we perform that way, it's a very alive way of playing, and I think that shows through at an audition. Next question. What is some rep that a student should know before taking on the Dvorak Cello Concerto? Okay, great question. The Dvorak, of course, is such a big and wonderful piece, and I do recommend that you kind of save it for when you're ready for it. I think it's a special time when you get to take on the Dvorak Concerto, and there are so many wonderful artists who are technically ready to play this piece at a younger age, and sometimes it's the right fit and sometimes it's not, and it's really a very personal. I think when you talk about what you need technically, of course we know like just technically speaking, you need great control over the upper positions. You need to be able to play octaves. You need to be able to cross the strings in the upper positions, which I think is a different skill in some ways. But I think what I would say is that you need to be able to do all of that and have lyricism, and I think that is really the key. So those concertos like Elgar and Saint-Saëns and Lalo, and those concertos that are lyrical builders in a certain way. Of course, they're wonderful concertos in their own right, but I do think that those are sort of important building blocks towards the Dvorak Cello Concerto, in terms of like really being able to play lyrically at the instrument. And as the music gets technically more advanced, I would say that there are that in terms of technique, Rococo variations is something that I would teach usually before Dvorak Concerto. I can't think of a time that I've taught them in another order. And again, for the same reason that we want to be able to have the kind of technical control to be able to play Rococo variations before we undertake the Dvorak Concerto. In the Kodai Sonata Movement 3 chords, what's your advice for keeping this is a very specific very specific place, and I don't have the Kodai Sonata right in front of me to find this exact spot, but the end of the question says, my small hand tilts and keeps the F sharp out of tune. And so I do think, again, this is like a small hand, big hand thing. And this is challenging. And, without me going directly into find the Kodai Sonata and find the specific passage, I do think that one of the things that we want to do when we think about chords is release chords. In other words, release the bottoms of the chords as we roll to the top, release the notes. I do think that getting finger balance when we play chords is really important, and releasing fingers. So my general advice is to release, and maybe just another sort of general principle of playing chords and getting them in tune and being well balanced is, if we put our weight onto our first and second fingers, which are very strong, our third and fourth fingers are often very weak, and they will sound flat. You're not really getting the note all the way to the bottom of the fingerboard. So I often tell my students when they're playing chords or double stops to balance the hand towards 3 and 4, and then come back and land 1. Wherever it is, in whatever position it is. So to really build the chord from the third and fourth fingers backwards. I think that's a really important way to play chords in tune. Another question: how would you recommend finding an advanced cello teacher for the high school years if there isn't one locally? Well, this is kind of an interesting time right now, actually, because many of us are teaching online lessons in a way that we have not before. And I know that right at this very moment, I'm teaching a couple of students who are not local, and in fact, a student or two who I have not met in person yet, although one of whom I'm going to be meeting at the summer festival that I'm teaching at the Credo Festival this summer. Although we were expecting to meet in person, but again, that's going to be online. But actually, this is a time when perhaps it is possible to connect to another teacher who's not in your area. What I would say is, if you do have a private teacher, you need to talk to your teacher about that first. That's really important that you are open with your private teacher. And if your private teacher says, I'd really prefer that you didn't do that, then of course that's exactly what you need to do. But if you're talking about finding a sole teacher, private teacher, this could be something to consider. And this could be like a small silver lining in this really challenging time that we're in right now. What pieces or etudes do you recommend to introduce thumb position and build that skill? Great question. I think that I mentioned my intermediate scale book, which is where I practice scales. I mentioned that I like to practice scales and thumb position. I have a few different ways that I like to practice scales, so I think scales are a great way to start with that. I think that, to me, the foundational piece at the advanced or the more advanced level for really building great thumb position technique is the last movement of hide and seek. So when I think of a student who I want them to have like a really awesome technique in the thumb positions, that is my go-to piece. So I would recommend that. Of course, there are a number of etudes that use thumb position. I think the challenge of the Popper etudes is that they're hard in many ways, we have to be thoughtful about which Popper etude. Many of them use thumb position, but choosing one where we're really focusing, or maybe even a passage or two from a particular etude. I think one of the things that's great about the Popper etudes is they do have us explore both diatonic and chromatic sequences in the thumb position, which I think are really valuable for building different hand shapes in the thumb position. One of the things that's interesting about cello technique is that in the lower positions, when we start out learning the cello, we really only learn 2 basic shapes. We learn what I would call a chromatic shape, where all the fingers are a half step away, or an extended or open shape where we have a whole step between 1 and 2. and we spend a lot of time with just those two shapes. And this is really different than the violin viola world, where they each finger can move, a half step in either direction, and they have so many different varieties of shapes. And of course, that's exactly what we have up high, that we can have, first finger can be upper or lower, and second finger and third finger, and even fourth finger. So I think that we need to develop that. What I would recommend, even at an intermediate level, when we're starting to introduce thumb position, is taking some of those like sort of foundational early pieces, those first position and second position pieces that you might have learned when you were just beginning cello, and to practice those in thumb position. And if you really want to challenge, you can practice them in different keys, or transposing thumb position. That would be like sort of a next level thought on that. Okay. Hello from Bolivia. Hello to you. And thank you very much for your time. Could you please show some warm-up exercises? Okay. I'm happy to show some of the warm-ups that I do. I know that many of us have a warm-up routine, and I was just mentioning the importance of a routine when it comes to taking auditions. But actually, with warm-ups, for me, I don't have a routine, and I actually really enjoy that about the way that I warm up. I do very much believe in warm-ups. I do warm-ups every single day, and I think they're very important for me and also for my students. So I know that some people, I always play open strings first, or I always do this certain scale routine first, and for me, I'm always trying to learn as a cellist, and I always have some things on my mind when I come to the cello, some things about my playing that I'm thinking about, and I'm always trying to think about how I want to advance myself as a cellist, in addition to how I want to be a great teacher. And so I often will tailor my warm-up to what I'm thinking about at any given moment. And sometimes I draw inspiration from my students. I notice what they're struggling with, and I devise a warm-up for them, and then I find that warm-up makes its way into my own routine. So let me just tell you just a few little warm-ups, or demonstrate a few warm-ups. So I would say that I have a couple of go-tos that are really an important part of my teaching and my warm-up, and one of them is the Sevchik exercises for the changing of position, Opus 8. I use the edition edited by Orlando Cole, and all my students have this, and I really think this is an incredibly valuable tool for us. It just, again, when we think about building the consistency of the hand shape up and down the string, when we think about finding beautiful sound all over the instrument, I just think there's almost nothing better. And I play them very slowly. I usually ask my students to play them with the metronome, sometimes on eighth note equals, as slow as eighth note equals 56 or 60. I'm playing them very slowly. Again, I'm trying to think about really noticing how it feels, getting that tactile awareness with the instrument, and so for me, I'm trying to build that tactile awareness when I play these kind of exercises, and it's a lot about how it feels. I think that's really important. That's why I play it slowly, and why I find value even in, I just played a little excerpt from the first of those. I am thinking about how I release my hand when I shift, how I rebalance my weight on each note. So I find that very valuable. I already mentioned the Kosman exercises in this discussion. I do like to practice 1 octave scales, and I like to practice them sometimes, 1 octave on each string, or even 2 octaves on each string. So I'm practicing going up higher on not just on the A string, but on other strings. Sometimes I can go up an octave and then start crossing over with thumb position and then continue up. So that's a little bit for more advanced students, but to start to think about different scale fingerings than the standard fingerings as a way to build the technique. I do practice open strings. I do practice vibrato. Sometimes I just practice vibrato exercises. And sometimes I might choose a short lyrical piece to play, like a Swan or a Song Without Words or Opera in Rev, as a way to sort of warm up my own vibrato. So that's just a little snippet of my own warm-up routine. Scales are a big part of it, and subject are a big part of it, and then I kind of build from there. Which concerto do you like to assign for an advanced high schooler? I think that this is very personal, and I think that this is something that you want to think about in consultation with your teacher. Again, I don't think there's the one winning concerto that's going to get you into a conservatory. I don't think it makes sense to play a concerto that's beyond your reach. I think it's important to play a piece that you play well, that you connect to musically, that provides challenges. I do really believe in challenges. I think I was mentioning that earlier, that I'm thinking about, when I choose repertoire, I'm thinking about how I can sort of build the cellist. So that's a big one, and it's an exciting one. So lots of choices there. What are the best ways to get a rich, wide vibrato? Great question. And I think that there are a few things that are really important for vibrato, and I know that many teachers have different approaches to vibrato. One of the things that I really believe in is, again, feeling very relaxed and balanced. So for me, one of the best ways to practice vibrato is here. And of course, I recommend that my students do this in school, when, of course, now we're not in school, but in the car, when you're away from the cello. And what I really like about this exercise, I'm changing fingers, is the way that the skin is wiggling on my fingertips. It's wiggling between the bone and the fingertip, and also the skin is wiggling on my forearm as I do this exercise. I like this exercise because it's impossible to squeeze with the thumb. I would hurt myself, so I naturally play with a light, soft thumb, and I feel my balance. So this is a great vibrato exercise. Some people teach that we want those knuckle joints to be loose. I think that's one way to get a really wide vibrato, is to think about loosening the joints. I don't generally teach a flat-fingered vibrato. I know some people use it. I think it's kind of a special effect, and I would stay away from it unless you have special permission. But I do think that you can think about using a little bit more of the pad of your finger when you do want that really wide, rich vibrato. So I'm using a little bit more pad, but I'm still keeping my round, curved shape. I also teach a couple of vibrato exercises where you can take a note and travel from if you think about vibrato, of course, you have to think about the two knobs, if you will, of vibrato, the width and the speed. And those are two knobs that you should be able to vary at infinite levels, really. So if I'm thinking about width, I could start with no vibrato. Practice widening out, and maybe more challenging than that is to practice narrowing that again. So that we really can control the amplitude of the vibrato. And of course, I have some exercises that just deal with the speed of the vibrato for when we want it faster, slower. And then again, if you think about this idea of tuning knobs, imagine you have 1 to 20, or maybe you even have 1 to 50, and you say, well, I'm going to set my width factor to 35, and I'm going to set my speed factor to 22, and what does that sound like? And then I'm going to bring my speed factor up to 45, but keep my width factor where it is, and what does that sound like? And I think I really believe in experimentation as part of the practice process. So I think those might be some kind of interesting ideas for you to pursue. Okay, so I think I've reached the end of my questions, and we're a little past our hour mark. So I really wanted to thank you for being here. First of all, it's really great to be able to speak with you and have this kind of a conversation. And I'd also especially want to thank Cello Bello for hosting this Cello Chat and all the Cello Chats that you host. I think it's an incredible service, and there's just so much knowledge on this site, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it, and happy to use it as a resource for myself and my students. And for those of you who are preparing an audition run for conservatory, good luck to you. Practice hard, and thank you so much. Have a great night. Bye-bye.